The Stellar Combat Institute on Vanguard Station represented the absolute pinnacle of galactic military education, assuming you define pinnacle as bureaucratic monument to institutional arrogance, wrapped in chrome and powered by delusions of competence. The station's rotating sections gleamed against the void like a mechanical jewel, each deck dedicated to forging the galaxy's finest warriors through methods that would have impressed medieval torturers for their creative application of systematic humiliation. At the heart of this educational paradise lay the Biological Superiority Index, a magnificently scientific-sounding classification system that essentially ranked species by their ability to break things efficiently. The BSI had been developed by committees of experts who possessed all the tactical wisdom of a particularly aggressive filing cabinet and twice the personality. The Vorthak occupied the coveted apex position. Naturally, these 12-foot-tall apex predators combined the best features of sharks, bears, and really angry philosophers, with exoskeletons that could deflect starship weapons and attitudes that could deflect basic human decency. Their homeworld was essentially a planet-sized gladiator arena, where survival required constantly proving your worth through elaborate displays of violence, which had produced a culture that treated courtesy as a character flaw and moderation as a mental illness. The Titanians held second place in this biological lottery, though calling them second anything felt like describing mountains as moderately tall rocks. These living geological formations averaged 15 feet in height, and possessed the kind of casual destructive capacity that made construction equipment jealous. Their idea of gentle exercise involved activities like recreational avalanche surfing and competitive volcano wrestling, which had given them all the social sensitivity of a seismic event. Plasma wraiths floated gracefully into third position, beings of pure energy who had transcended the tedious limitations of physical matter and never let anyone forget it. They communicated through precisely modulated electromagnetic frequencies and moved with the fluid grace of living lightning, which made them excellent at combat and insufferable at parties. Their energy-based physiology allowed them to phase through solid matter, manipulate electrical systems, and project an aura of smug superiority that could be detected from orbit. The Saurians claimed fourth place through a combination of predatory reflexes, venomous bite, and the kind of paranoid cunning that came from evolving on a planet where everything was trying to eat everything else simultaneously. Their scales provided natural armor, their enhanced metabolism allowed superhuman speed, and their cold-blooded pragmatism made them excellent strategic planners and terrible dinner guests. And then, occupying the prestigious Category 9 position somewhere between statistical error and clerical mistake, sat humanity. The galactic military establishment had collectively decided that humans represented nature's attempt at creating a species optimized for filing reports and providing moral support to actual warriors. They were classified as fragile support species, with a notation that their primary military application involved logistical coordination and morale enhancement, which was bureaucratic terminology for keeping them away from anything that might hurt them. The Institute's training philosophy embraced this natural hierarchy with the enthusiasm of people who had confused prejudice with pedagogy. Each species received instruction tailored to their biological realities, which meant the Vorthak learned advanced combat techniques while humans learned advanced coffee preparation. It was equality through separate but unequal treatment, applied with all the subtlety of a diplomatic incident. Drillmaster Vextar embodied this institutional wisdom, with the dedication of someone who had found his true calling in making smaller creatures feel inadequate. Standing 12 feet of chitinous authority, his compound eyes glowed with the satisfied intensity of a critic reviewing particularly disappointing performance art. His mandibles clicked in rhythmic patterns that conveyed complex emotions, ranging from mild contempt to profound disappointment, with occasional variations that suggested he was mentally composing poetry about the futility of hope. The daily routine at the Institute followed a carefully choreographed pattern designed to reinforce everyone's proper place in the biological hierarchy. Morning calisthenics that would have killed most humans were followed by tactical simulations that somehow always concluded with human personnel being reassigned to support roles, which was military terminology for "try not to get in the way." Maya Chen Okafor navigated this environment with the fluid grace of someone who had long ago accepted that the universe was neither fair nor particularly interested in her opinions about its management style. At 5'7", with the kind of unremarkable build that made furniture salespeople ignore her, she represented everything the Institute considered adorably inadequate about human military potential. Her performance evaluations consistently rated her as satisfactory for species parameters, which translated roughly to surprisingly competent at not dying immediately. The instructors treated her achievements with the kind of patronizing encouragement typically reserved for particularly clever pets who had learned to use the bathroom correctly. The other cadets had developed their own methods for interacting with the Institute's token human, Granite, a Titanian whose emotional range spanned from mildly seismic to catastrophically geological, acknowledged her existence through occasional grunts that registered approximately 3.2 on the Richter scale. His crystalline features reflected light in patterns that somehow managed to convey condescension, which was honestly impressive for a living rock formation. Flux drifted through conversations with the ethereal superiority that came naturally to beings who had transcended physical limitations and gained the ability to be insufferably smug about it. The plasma wraith's energy form shifted through colors that probably conveyed deep philosophical insights in electromagnetic culture, but mostly just made everyone else dizzy. Flux's contributions to group discussions typically involved observations like your carbon-based reasoning lacks proper quantum resonance, which was energy being terminology for I disagree, but in a spiritually enlightened way. Razor represented the Saurian approach to interspecies relations, treating every interaction as a potential threat assessment and every conversation as reconnaissance for future conflicts. The scaled warrior's predatory instincts had been honed on a homeworld where paranoia was considered basic survival skills, which meant he evaluated Maya's breakfast choices with the same tactical consideration most species reserved for actual military campaigns. Combat training sessions in the adaptive combat arena had become a reliable source of entertainment for everyone except Maya. The arena could simulate everything from zero-gravity boarding actions to atmospheric combat in hostile environments. Though somehow every scenario seemed calibrated to highlight human limitations with surgical precision, Vexstar approached these demonstrations with the theatrical enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed his work and had never met a teaching moment. He couldn't turn into an elaborate humiliation ritual. His instructional methods combined practical combat techniques with performance art, creating educational experiences that were both informative and psychologically devastating. The morning's lesson focused on species-appropriate combat applications, which sounded progressive and scientifically rigorous right up until you realized it was essentially an excuse for Vexstar to demonstrate why humans had no business pretending to be warriors. He began with his standard lecture about biological limitations, delivered with the kind of helpful condescension that made educational television seem hostile by comparison. Granite served as the first demonstration partner, lumbering into the arena's center with the confident stride of someone whose worst fear was running out of things to punch. Vexstar circled the massive Titanian with predatory grace, his movements flowing like liquid violence around living stone. When he struck, it was with calculated precision that made combat look like mathematics, and Granite hit the padded floor with enough force to make the station's structural integrity monitors emit worried beeps. Flux's demonstration proved equally educational, though watching energy-based beings fight always looked like someone had given a light show weapons training and unlimited creative freedom. The plasma wraith's form shifted and flowed around Vexstar's attacks with ethereal grace until the Drillmaster managed to disrupt the energy matrix with a precisely placed strike, causing Flux to collapse into a puddle of disappointed photons that flickered with what might have been embarrassment. Razor's turn lasted exactly 9 seconds, which was longer than his dignity could survive, but shorter than his species' reputation for tactical superiority could endure. The Saurian's famous speed and reflexes proved less impressive when facing an opponent who had been perfecting violence since before most civilizations had invented proper grammar. And then Vexstar's compound eyes fixed on Maya with a kind of predatory satisfaction that suggested he had been saving the best for last. The arena fell silent, except for the hum of gravity generators, and the subtle sound of everyone's expectations falling through the floor with terminal velocity. "Ah, our human representative," Vextar announced, his mandibles clicking with barely contained glee. "Perhaps today, we can finally provide a practical demonstration of why certain species excel at administrative duties rather than combat operations." The assembled cadets shifted with the uncomfortable energy of people watching a traffic accident unfold in slow motion. Everyone knew how this would end, which somehow made it both more entertaining and more tragic. Maya stood and walked toward the arena's center with the calm stride of someone who had stopped caring about other people's expectations and started focusing on more immediate concerns, like not getting killed for entertainment purposes. Vextar launched into his pre-demonstration monologue, a carefully crafted performance that combined tactical instruction with psychological warfare. He explained force differentials and combat biomechanics with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work, gesturing expansively at Maya as though she were a particularly interesting specimen in a museum of evolutionary mistakes. "Observe the classic human stance," he continued, circling her with theatrical precision. "Note the obvious structural weaknesses, the laughable reach disadvantage, the complete absence of natural weapons or defensive adaptations. This species somehow convinced itself that enthusiasm could substitute for evolution, which represents either touching optimism or spectacular delusion depending on your philosophical perspective." The other cadets watched with varying degrees of interest and sympathy. Granite's crystalline features reflected boredom from multiple angles simultaneously. Flux's energy form pulsed with colors that might have indicated secondhand embarrassment for everyone involved. Razor's scales rippled with suppressed predatory instincts as he calculated threat assessments that apparently included basic physics. Maya remained perfectly still throughout the commentary, her expression maintaining the kind of professional neutrality that suggested she was either calculating something complex or had achieved enlightenment through repeated exposure to institutional stupidity. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, her weight distributed evenly, her breathing steady and controlled. "Now then," Vextar announced, settling into his preferred combat stance with obvious theatrical relish. "Let us observe what transpires when biological reality encounters human aspirations. Please, demonstrate your species' renowned fighting capabilities." The invitation hung in the recycled air like a challenge wrapped in mockery and seasoned with institutional condescension. Maya looked up at the towering Vorthak with a kind of calm assessment that accountants use when examining suspicious expense reports and generals use when studying terrain that's about to become significantly more interesting. She stepped forward with economical grace, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion that managed to look both casual and purposeful. Her right hand came up in what appeared to be an almost apologetic gesture, her fist traveling perhaps 20 inches before making contact with Vextar's thorax region. The punch looked utterly unremarkable. No dramatic preparation, no battle cry, no visible exertion or strain. Just a simple, straightforward movement that connected with Vextar's exoskeleton with a sound like knuckles tapping politely on a particularly solid door. Vextar's initial reaction followed the script perfectly. His compound eyes glittered with amusement, his mandibles produced those distinctive clicking sounds that passed for laughter among his species, and his entire posture radiated the kind of vindicated satisfaction that came from having one's lowest expectations thoroughly confirmed. "Delightful," he began, his voice carrying across the arena with practiced theatrical timing. "Truly, that represents the Revance's absolute pinnacle of human combat effectiveness. I particularly appreciate the gentle approach, which suggests your species has at least developed the wisdom not to injure itself when attempting violence against superior life forms." The laughter started among the watching cadets, a low rumble of shared amusement at the predictable conclusion to another lesson in biological reality. Even the arena's monitoring systems seemed to hum with mechanical satisfaction at the orderly resolution of another training exercise. But then something distinctly non-standard happened. Vextar's expression shifted from amused superiority to mild confusion, as though someone had just asked him to solve differential equations using interpretive dance. His compound eyes lost their confident glitter and took on the glazed look of someone trying to remember something important that was hovering just beyond conscious recall. The laughter died away as Vextar swayed slightly, his exoskeleton producing a series of small sounds that definitely weren't part of his usual emotional vocabulary. He looked down at Maya with the kind of bewildered expression that reality occasionally produces when it decides to present someone with a bill they weren't expecting to pay. "That was," he began, then stopped, his mandibles working soundlessly as though the appropriate words had suddenly gone on strike. His legs buckled with the dignified collapse of a controlled demolition, and he toppled backward onto the arena's padded surface with enough force to make the gravity generators emit concerned warning tones. The arena erupted into the kind of chaos that emerges when everyone's fundamental assumptions about how the universe operates decide to take an unscheduled vacation. Granite's crystalline features reflected confusion from 17 different angles simultaneously. Flux's energy form cycled through several colors that definitely weren't included in any regulation handbook. Razor's predatory instincts kicked into overdrive, scanning for threats that apparently included basic physics and reliable causality. Medical personnel materialized with the efficient panic of people who had trained extensively for every conceivable emergency except the one that was actually happening. They surrounded Vextar's unconscious form with scanners, stimulants, and a kind of professional bewilderment that suggested their equipment wasn't designed to process paradoxes. The Institute's investigation began approximately 27 seconds after Vextar hit the floor, which represented impressively rapid response time even by military standards. Senior instructors appeared like bureaucratic ninjas, their faces displaying the grim determination that comes from realizing someone was about to become intimately familiar with the Institute's disciplinary procedures. Commander Helix arrived within minutes, his Altarian form radiating the kind of authoritative presence that came from decades of dealing with impossible situations and unreasonable people. His bioluminescent patches pulsed in patterns that suggested deep thought, administrative annoyance, and the dawning realization that his afternoon schedule had just become significantly more complicated. The medical team's preliminary report read like something composed by committee and edited by someone having an existential crisis. Vextar had sustained what could diplomatically be called comprehensive systemic disruption, including internal hemorrhaging, neurological trauma, and something the scanners classified as cascade resonance failure, which sounded impressively technical until you tried to figure out what it actually meant in practical terms. Dr. Quantum, the Institute's chief medical officer, approached the problem with the methodical precision that had made her famous throughout the sector for solving impossible medical puzzles and infamous for her complete inability to explain them in terms anyone else could understand. Without advanced degrees in theoretical biology, her analysis of Vextar's condition involved increasingly creative applications of medical terminology to describe injuries that shouldn't have been physically possible given the apparent cause. The human punch had somehow triggered what she eventually labeled delayed kinetic cascade syndrome, which was medical jargon for something really weird happened, and we have no idea what or how. Maya remained in the arena throughout the investigation, answering questions with the kind of patient professionalism that suggested she had been expecting this conversation for quite some time. Her responses were precise, factual, and completely unhelpful to anyone trying to understand how a gentle tap had managed to floor a 12-foot apex predator whose species had dominated galactic combat sports for 3 centuries. The Institute's combat analysis team arrived with enough scanning equipment to outfit a small research station. They recorded impact vectors, energy transfer coefficients, and biomechanical stress patterns with the desperate thoroughness of people who suspected the universe was conducting an elaborate practical joke at their expense. Their findings challenged several fundamental assumptions about physics, biology, and the general reliability of cause and effect relationships. The punch had generated force multiplication effects that violated approximately 16 different conservation laws, created resonance patterns that shouldn't have existed outside theoretical physics, and somehow managed to bypass Vorthak natural defenses through methods that made their equipment emit confused error messages. Commander Helix requested a private consultation with Maya, which took place in his office with all the warmth and comfort of a tax audit conducted in a refrigerated morgue. His questions started simple and gradually escalated toward the kind of complexity that suggested someone was either very intelligent or very confused about fundamental reality. Maya's explanations introduced concepts that most galactic military theorists had never seriously considered, primarily because they involved taking human capabilities seriously instead of treating them as an extended cosmic comedy routine. She discussed gravitational adaptation, atmospheric pressure conditioning, and metabolic optimization with the casual expertise of someone who had never realized these were supposed to be exotic concepts. Earth's environmental conditions, she explained with patient precision, had produced a species adapted to function under circumstances that most galactic civilizations would classify as actively hostile to intelligent life. Humans had evolved under gravitational stress that would crush most species, in atmospheric conditions that would poison others, and with metabolic requirements that demanded constant optimization for survival. The Institute's Xenobiology department was summoned to verify these claims, arriving with enough testing equipment to stock a research facility and enough skepticism to power a small industrial installation. Their analysis of human physiology revealed adaptation patterns that read like engineering specifications for a biological weapons system disguised as a maintenance manual. Human bone density exceeded galactic norms by factors that made the measurements look like clerical errors. Muscle fiber efficiency operated at levels that challenged several accepted theories about biological limitations. Cardiovascular performance suggested a species designed for sustained combat operations under conditions that would hospitalize most other life forms. Dr. Helix, the department's leading expert on comparative combat physiology, summarized his findings with the kind of professional bewilderment that comes from discovering your fundamental assumptions were not just wrong, but embarrassingly, spectacularly wrong in ways that called your entire education into question. Humans, he reported to the increasingly uncomfortable assembly of senior staff, represented what could only be described as evolutionary overengineering on a species-wide scale. They were biological systems optimized for survival in conditions that most civilizations would classify as uninhabitable, which had produced capabilities that looked like design flaws until you realized they were actually military specifications written by a hostile universe. The punch that had felled Vextar hadn't been gentle at all. It had been precisely calibrated to exploit structural weaknesses in Vorthak exoskeleton design, delivered with the kind of mechanical efficiency that came from growing up in an environment where imprecision meant immediate death. The impact had transferred kinetic energy through resonance patterns that Vorthak biology wasn't equipped to handle, creating cascade failures that propagated through his nervous system like a chain reaction of unfortunate biological events. Maya had essentially delivered the biological equivalent of a precisely tuned electromagnetic pulse, targeted at vulnerabilities that Vextar's species had never needed to defend against because no one else in the galaxy had been foolish enough to try solving complex problems by punching them with calibrated precision. The Institute's tactical assessment team spent 4 days trying to understand how human combat techniques had evolved to exploit weaknesses that other species didn't even know they possessed. Their report read like a military analysis of a threat that had been hiding in plain sight while everyone was looking in completely different directions for several centuries. Human fighting styles, they concluded, represented evolutionary responses to environmental pressures that had produced combat effectiveness through methods that looked primitive, but operated on principles that most advanced civilizations had never needed to consider. It was like discovering that someone had been building faster than light drives using stone tools, while everyone else was still figuring out basic metallurgy. Vextar's recovery took 6 days, during which time the medical staff learned more about Vorthak physiology than anyone had particularly wanted to know. His awakening was gradual, confused, and accompanied by the kind of neurological recalibration that suggested his brain was running comprehensive diagnostic checks on everything he thought he knew about reality. His first coherent words upon regaining consciousness were, "What exactly did she hit me with?" Which doctor? Quantum interpreted as a positive sign that his cognitive functions were returning to something approximating baseline normal. Assuming baseline normal included healthy skepticism about the fundamental nature of physical reality. The Institute's response to the incident involved the kind of administrative scrambling that happens when institutional assumptions collide with inconvenient facts at relativistic velocities. Policy revisions were drafted, training protocols were reconsidered, and several senior staff members spent long nights questioning their career choices and the general reliability of everything they thought they knew. Human training requirements underwent immediate comprehensive revision, transitioning from remedial basic competency with safety accommodations to advanced threat assessment, pending further analysis and possible reclassification. Maya found herself reassigned to specialized programs that had previously been reserved for species, with documented histories of not being laughably inadequate at violence. The other cadets' attitudes shifted with the kind of speed that comes from people realizing they had been fundamentally wrong about something important and potentially dangerous. Granite's crystalline features began reflecting what might charitably be called respect, though it was difficult to determine whether this represented genuine personal growth or simply enlightened self-preservation instincts. Flux's energy form took on warmer, more respectful colors when interacting with Maya, suggesting either genuine friendship or the electromagnetic equivalent of diplomatic immunity. Razor's predatory assessment protocols seemed to have quietly reclassified her from harmless support personnel to potential existential threat, which passed for professional courtesy among paranoid reptilian warriors. The Galactic Military Command received a classified report that diplomatically suggested previous assessments of human combat potential might have contained what could generously be called significant analytical oversights. This bureaucratic masterpiece managed to convey complete policy reversal while maintaining the comfortable fiction that no one had made embarrassing mistakes that would require public acknowledgement or professional accountability. Within months, human military applications began receiving the kind of serious consideration previously reserved for species, with documented histories of not being cosmic punchlines. Several recruitment offices quietly added Earth to their list of preferred candidate sources, though they were careful to phrase this as expanded diversity initiatives rather than "we were completely wrong about everything for several centuries." Maya continued her training with the steady professionalism that had carried her through the Institute's original misconceptions about her species' military potential. She mastered advanced combat techniques, strategic analysis, and interspecies diplomacy with the same unassuming competence that had made her invisible right up until the moment she became impossible to ignore safely. Commander Helix's final report on the incident included the kind of dry observations that military historians would eventually quote when trying to explain how entire galactic civilizations could systematically underestimate obvious threats for extended periods. His conclusion noted that assumptions about species capabilities should perhaps be based on empirical analysis rather than comfortable prejudices. Though he phrased this revelation in terms that preserved everyone's professional dignity, the Institute's new unofficial motto, quietly adopted after the incident, became "Verify everything, assume nothing," which represented probably the most intellectually honest institutional slogan in galactic military history. It replaced the previous motto, "Excellence through natural hierarchy," which had become awkwardly inappropriate following recent revelations about the relationship between hierarchy and actual excellence. Vextar returned to duty with the kind of subdued professionalism that comes from having one's worldview surgically readjusted by uncomfortable reality. His training methods evolved to emphasize practical assessment over theoretical assumptions, though he never quite recovered his previous enthusiasm for theatrical demonstrations involving species he had previously considered inherently inferior. His interactions with Maya developed into something resembling professional respect seasoned with the kind of cautious wariness that intelligent predators reserve for prey that has proven unexpectedly capable of comprehensive retaliation. Their training sessions became exercises in mutual education, with each learning to appreciate capabilities they had previously dismissed or catastrophically underestimated. The Stellar Combat Institute continued producing capable warriors, though with significantly revised understanding of what capability actually meant when applied to beings who hadn't grown up in the universe's more forgiving neighborhoods. The Biological Superiority Index underwent quiet retirement, replaced by more flexible classification systems that acknowledged reality's apparent fondness for making confident predictions look foolish. And somewhere in the Institute's archives, filed under Instructional Incidents of Historical Significance, a comprehensive report documented the day when millennia of assumptions about human fragility encountered 20 inches of precisely applied contrary evidence. The galaxy had learned an important lesson about the dangers of mistaking packaging for contents, though it took considerably longer to admit this lesson publicly or implement the necessary policy changes. The universe, as it turned out, maintained quite the sense of humor about the whole situation. It just wasn't the kind of humor that military institutions were particularly well equipped to appreciate, especially when the punchline involved discovering that their most carefully protected support personnel had been carrying around the biological equivalent of concealed weapons, while everyone else was busy being confidently wrong about fundamental reality. Maya Chen Okafor graduated with distinguished honors, specializing in interspecies tactical analysis and adaptive combat optimization. Her dissertation on environmental pressure as evolutionary weapons development became required reading at military academies throughout the sector, though most instructors were diplomatically careful to present it as theoretical advancement rather than comprehensive indictment of previous institutional competence. She served with quiet distinction in several conflicts, where her ability to identify and exploit species-specific vulnerabilities proved remarkably effective at resolving diplomatic tensions that had previously required extensive military intervention and significant property damage. Her methods remained understated, precise, and devastatingly effective, much like the punch that had initiated everything. The galaxy had always prided itself on rational assessment of military capabilities and logical resource allocation, right up until it discovered that rationality functioned significantly better when it wasn't filtered through several centuries of comfortable assumptions about who was supposed to be dangerous and who was supposed to provide administrative support and moral encouragement. Somewhere in the vast bureaucracy of Galactic Military Command, policy analysts were still trying to calculate how an entire interstellar civilization could systematically underestimate a species for extended periods, while that species quietly went about the business of being exactly as formidable as their environment had trained them to be, which turned out to be considerably more formidable than anyone had bothered to notice. It was, when viewed from the appropriate philosophical distance, exactly the kind of cosmic irony that the universe seemed to specialize in producing. The galaxy's most carefully protected support species had turned out to be precision weapon systems, disguised as filing clerks, and everyone had been too busy congratulating themselves on their enlightened classification systems to notice the rather obvious warning signs.